The cold April morning of 2018 began with an unusual disturbance on the slopes of Hatcher Pass. 6 unmarked Alaska State Troopers vehicles quietly stopped at the entrance to the abandoned Independence mine, where a powerful thaw had caused a sudden collapse of earth and rock. Local residents stood huddled behind porches and windows, watching officers in tactical gear position themselves around the newly exposed opening. Less than a mile away, in a modest wooden cabin, Mark Halter, 63 years old, was preparing his morning coffee, a routine he had followed for many years as a quiet neighbor, part-time handyman, and familiar face in the small town. A sharp knock came at 7:18 a.m. Mark Halter, Alaska State Troopers. We have a search warrant related to the disappearance of 3 teenagers in 2003. Officers later described how his hand paused briefly on the coffee pot handle, but his face remained eerily calm, as if he had always known this moment would eventually arrive. Some names and details in this story have been changed to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene. On the afternoon of October 12, 2003, the air in Wasilla, Alaska carried the distinctive chill of early winter, as daylight faded quickly and the mountains of Hatcher Pass were shrouded in a hazy gray-blue mist. The area around Independence Mine, usually quiet and sparsely visited at this time of year, lay silent under the darkening sky. 3 local teenagers, Evan Mercer, 11 years old, Jonah Mercer, 13 years old, and Caleb Wexler, 14 years old, left their home shortly after 4 p.m. Their departure attracted no particular attention, aside from a distant glance from Mark Halter, a man living in the area, who later stated he had seen the 3 boys moving in the direction of the trail leading to the abandoned mine. The light was already diminishing, and the temperature was dropping faster than usual. By around 7 p.m., when darkness had enveloped the entire valley and none of the children had returned at their usual time, the Mercer family began to worry. They contacted the Wexler family to check if Caleb had stopped by, but all 3 were missing. Within the next 20 minutes, the families organized their own search around the neighborhood, following the paths the children usually took. But poor lighting and the beginning of freezing ground limited their efforts. No signs of the boys' direction or presence were found. At 7:40 p.m., after ruling out the possibility that the boys had gone to friends' houses or stayed at a familiar spot on their own, the families officially called the Alaska State Troopers to report them missing. The time of the call also marked the establishment of the case, classifying the 3 teenagers as missing under high-risk environmental conditions, and beginning a search and verification process that the families could not have imagined would last far longer than anyone anticipated. When the Mercer family's missing persons call was transferred to the Alaska State Troopers at 7:40 p.m. on October 12, 2003, the case intake procedure was activated immediately. The on-duty officer responsible for the Matanuska-Susitna area recorded all initial information and established the necessary timelines to build the sequence of events related to the disappearance of the 3 teenagers. The first step was to confirm the time they left home. Based on independent statements from both families and scattered observations in the neighborhood, troopers determined the approximate time the boys left the residential area was between 400 and 420 p.m. This time frame aligned with the daily habits of all 3 and coincided with the sun beginning to lower, creating gradually weakening light over the following tens of minutes. From there, troopers moved to the second timeline marker, the time witness Mark Halter saw the 3 teenagers. When contacted again that same evening, Halter provided an estimated window of 4,025 to 4,040 p.m. Although his observation was made from a relatively distant vantage point and it did not allow for detailed identification, troopers recorded this as the last confirmed sighting of the group. The third timeline marker was established as the time the families noticed the abnormality, around 7:07 p.m. This was when the 3 teenagers should have been home if they had only been playing around the neighborhood as usual. The simultaneous absence of all 3, an extremely rare occurrence, caused the Mercer and Wexler families to realize something was wrong. Between 7:08 and 7:20 p.m., the families conducted a spontaneous search around the home area and nearby places the children frequently visited. These efforts yielded no signs whatsoever, leading to the assessment that the situation was beyond the family's ability to handle alone. From this point, troopers focused on collecting all initial statements. The families confirmed the 3 teenagers had no plans to go far, carried no special equipment, and had no appointments with friends outside the group. There were no signs of conflict or unusual events during the day that could explain the prolonged absence. Next, troopers cross-referenced weather and lighting conditions. Data from the National Weather Service confirmed sunset around 6:00 p.m., causing the Hatcher Pass area to quickly fall into darkness due to the high mountain terrain blocking remaining light. Temperatures dropped sharply from about 27 degrees fire to 19 degrees fire over 3 hours, with average cold winds of 10 to 16 miles per hour. Such conditions created serious risk if the teenagers had entered forested mountain areas or the mine without proper gear. After gathering complete timeline data, troopers proceeded to identify potential approach routes the teenagers may have taken. From Halter's statement, combined with the boys' usual movement patterns in the area, the route leading to Hatcher Pass and Independence Mine was quickly placed in the high-risk category. This was the only route matching Halter's report, and also the location with the greatest risks in terms of terrain and weather. Troopers analyzed the feasibility of other movement directions, but most were ruled out due to inconsistency with the timeline or geographic conditions. When all initial data was compiled, troopers assessed the urgency of the case. This was a missing persons incident involving miners under high-risk environmental conditions, with rapid onset of darkness, dropping temperatures, and very limited victim coping capacity. This placed the case in the high-priority rapid response category, requiring immediate mobilization of search forces that night and establishment of an initial check perimeter around the point of origin and trails heading toward the mountain range. Troopers officially opened the investigation file for 3 missing victims, marking the start of a complex search and verification process in which the foundational data built that evening would guide the entire initial investigation phase. When the Alaska State Troopers moved to establishing the initial search perimeter, their focus was on precisely identifying the areas the 3 teenagers could have reached during the time from leaving home until the families noticed their absence. Since there were no signs the group left the residential area by vehicle, troopers limited the initial movement radius to the distance walkable in just over 2 hours, based on the physical condition and daily habits of Evan, Jonah, and Caleb. Information from families and neighbors helped narrow down familiar locations the group often visited, including several sparse wooded areas near the homes, an open clearing behind the row of mobile homes, and a narrow trail cutting through low brush. These locations were classified as low to medium probability sites because they were far from the witness's line of sight and inconsistent with the rapid onset of darkness that afternoon. Nevertheless, troopers deployed checks to rule out the possibility the boys were injured or stuck near the residential area. During the sweep, the search team found no unusual signs such as drag marks, disturbed soil and rock, or personal items that might have been dropped. This led troopers to shift focus to evaluating the trail route from the homes heading north, where unofficial paths converged that locals used to access the lower part of Hatcher Pass. Verifying the trail became the central step because it matched the direction Mark Halter described. The investigation team analyzed basic topographic maps to identify natural paths connecting the residential area to the mountain foothills. Among the many small trails interspersed between brush clusters and frozen ground strips, one wider trail stood out due to compacted soil and wear marks on the vegetation layer created by pedestrians and visitors. This was the only direct connection from the residential area to the direction Halter saw the 3 teenagers heading. As the search team conducted on-site inspection along this route, troopers recorded several important surface features. The thin new snow cover from the day was easily disturbed, allowing observation of small surface changes if people or animals had passed through. Snow in the middle of the trail showed uneven compression, especially at slight depressions shaped like footprints. Although cold wind and darkness after 6 p.m. had obscured many traces, in some sections the snow appeared lightly churned, indicating surface disturbance from foot movement or carried objects. These were not definitive signs confirming the tracks belonged to the 3 teenagers, but the nature and direction of the compressions aligned with movement toward the mountain route. Troopers also noted the absence of return movement signs, meaning no tracks led back toward the residential area in the opposite direction along this route. This ruled out the possibility the group had only gone for a short walk and returned. Another point troopers recorded was the distribution of disturbed snow depth near the trailhead. Snow was only lightly compressed, while several hundred meters from the residential area, snow was more deeply churned, possibly because the group began to speed up or changed their movement pattern as they neared the forested and gently sloping area. This transition was considered consistent with late afternoon movement behavior when children often hurried to reach their destination before full darkness. Additionally, troopers checked side branches along the trail leading to small clearings or tree hollows. No signs indicated the group stopped or turned onto these side paths, as the snow surface showed no corresponding disturbance. This helped narrow the plausible route to a straight path extending from the residential area toward the lower area of Hatcher Pass. After completing inspection of the entire initial length of the route, troopers reevaluated the information to check for contradictions between field data and witness statements. But all signs reinforced the hypothesis that the three teenagers had moved exactly in the direction Halter described. From these observations, troopers officially determined that the highest probability movement direction was the route extending toward the area accessing Independence Mine, and this would be the priority zone in the expanded search phase. Based on the surface observations along the trail leading to Hatcher Pass, Alaska State Troopers moved to terrain analysis to build a strategic search plan suited to the actual conditions of the area. The terrain around Wasilla and Hatcher Pass is characterized by a mix of sparse forest, moderately steep mountain slopes, and rocky debris zones, creating varying levels of risk for unprepared travelers, especially minors. Troopers classified the area into three main groups: forest trail, exposed mountain slope, and the area near Independence Mine, each with different risk levels and accessibility. The forest trail was considered medium risk because, while it could cause disorientation or obstruct visibility in darkness, the terrain was generally flatter and lacked dangerously deep drop-offs. The mountain slope was ranked high risk due to the slippery nature of cold rock surfaces, rapid changes in gradient, and the potential for falls leading to serious injury. Meanwhile, the area around Independence Mine, with its many deteriorated old structures, open pits, and abandoned tunnels, was assessed as very high risk, especially under low-light conditions that made obstacles or entrances hard to spot. From these classification criteria, troopers established two priority search levels. Level 1 priority area included the main trail from the residential area to the mountain base and the lower mountain slope, as this was the zone the boys would have had to pass through with continuing upward, and also the place most likely to experience incidents due to disorientation in rapidly darkening conditions. This range was prioritized for initial search force access due to short travel time and wide coverage potential, allowing quick resolution of possible scenarios. Level 2 priority area was established as the entire higher portion of Hatcher Pass in the peripheral zone around Independence Mine. This was a harder-to-access area requiring search personnel experienced in mountain terrain and familiar with the old mine's hazard points. Since the three teenagers were seen moving in this direction, the Level 2 range, though large, had a high probability of containing key clues if the group had approached near the mine. After establishing priority zones, troopers coordinated search forces by area. Forces in the Level 1 priority area included ground patrol teams coordinated with local volunteers familiar with forest terrain and trails, deployed to move along walking routes to sweep all possible branches leading to depressions or frozen water collection points. These teams had to continuously update coordinates and log checkpoints to ensure no area was missed within the optimal low-light range. In the Level 2 priority area, troopers deployed personnel skilled in mountaineering and experienced in complex terrain search. This team was tasked with covering access routes to the mine, identifying loose rock fields or areas prone to fall accidents, and recording any abnormal surface changes compared to standard topographic maps. Because the area around Independence Mine had many unstable old structures, the search team was instructed to avoid direct entry into tunnels or open portals in the initial phase and to focus only on surveying the surrounding surface. In addition, troopers coordinated support logistics to maintain communication between teams, establishing temporary control stations at a high vantage point overlooking both the approach area and the return path to the residential zone. All these steps ensured the search was implemented systematically, suited to actual terrain, and focused on zones with the highest probability of traces, following the movement direction verified from witness information and initial data. When the strategic search plan had been divided according to priority areas, Alaska State Troopers deployed the team approaching the mine route, viewing this as the pivotal step to determine whether the three teenagers had actually moved deep into the mountain area. The suspect route was selected based on cross-referencing Mark Halter's statement, topographic maps, and surface signs collected during the initial sweep phase. The search group proceeded along the main trail connecting the residential area to the lower part of Hatcher Pass, a route of moderate length but sufficiently rugged to pose risk under rapidly diminishing light and dropping temperatures. As they entered the sparse forest and mixed rocky ground section, troopers began recording signs potentially related to the three teenagers' movement. The first sign appeared in a stretch of unevenly compressed snow extending uphill. The snow surface here had slight depressions, not sharp due to wind and cold, but the compression shape indicated more than one person had passed through. The depth of the compressions matched the weight of adolescents, and the distribution showed irregular footstep patterns characteristic of children walking together. These observations were recorded and GPS positioned for path reconstruction. Not far from that position, at the edge of a small rock field, snow was churned in a gentle curve, not in footprint form but resembling an object swept across the surface during movement. Though the exact cause could not yet be determined, troopers viewed this as an important peripheral clue because the disturbance shape fit the possibility the group had carried items that could impact the snow surface while heading toward the mountain slope. Another section of the trail showed broken vegetation under the snow, possibly from trampling, forming a narrow but clearly directed wear mark along the axis advancing into the eastern slope of Halter Pass. These changes, though not allowing precise timing, remained significant signs because the area saw little traffic in cold season, so surface impacts carried high investigative weight. Troopers also recorded the appearance of a zone of deeper than normal snow subsidence near the base of a brush cluster, where the underlying ground had slight elevation difference. This uneven subsidence fit the movement of a small group traveling in low-light conditions, possibly causing footsteps to stray briefly off the trail before returning to the main direction. Recording such small changes allowed investigators to reinforce the hypothesis that the teenagers had penetrated deeper into the sparse forest and were heading up the slope toward the lower mine area. Some low-height broken branches, without signs of large animal activity, were also assessed as potentially related to the children moving through narrow areas. Troopers recovered no personal items belonging to the three teenagers, consistent with the boys not carrying easily droppable objects. Therefore, the peripheral signs, including compressed snow, churned surface, broken vegetation layer, and broken branches, became the primary data source for establishing the movement route. These observations were synthesized to determine high likelihood that the teenagers had followed a consistent path leading to the abandoned mine, while reinforcing the assessment that the suspect route was correct and required continued expanded inspection on deeper slope sections. When surface signs along the trail confirmed the three teenagers' movement toward Halter Pass, Alaska State Troopers shifted to assessing the possibility of mine entry through the main entrance of Independence Mine, a factor that needed early verification to rule out or strengthen hypotheses related to the group approaching this area. The main mine entrance was located at the edge of the historic preserve, managed under regulation, and typically closed during cold season except for seasonal tourism access. Upon the search team's approach to this location, troopers noted that the main entry door, reinforced with metal plating and secure lock, remained intact. There were no signs of mechanical tampering such as prying, bent hinges, or damaged blocks. Checking the ground around the entrance, troopers observed thin snow cover with some compression streaks, but no clear footprints. Given cold wind and the snow surface's tendency to lightly melt during the day, then refreeze when colder, these compression marks could have formed earlier and were not necessarily tied to the time of the teenagers' disappearance. Although it could not be asserted that no one approached the main entrance area on October 12, troopers also found no signs indicating the three teenagers had entered the mine via this route. Regarding practical accessibility, investigators assessed that the main entrance was not an easy choice for children if they wanted to explore the area, as the location sat on an open slope with little tree cover and was typically not the target of spontaneous trips due to lack of shelter or visually appealing features for kids. Additionally, moving from the trail directly up to the main entrance required detouring around a wide rock field, which contradicted the fairly direct path previously indicated by surface traces along the route. Troopers also analyzed the possibility the group approached near the main entrance without intent to enter. However, no signs showed the boys stopped here, no wide churned snow area, no stomping, drawing, or typical activity when children observe an interesting sight. On the other hand, the light compression streaks near the entrance were diffuse and did not form any continuous movement chain from the trail upward, indicating no consistent presence of the group in this area. After analyzing all facts, troopers concluded that the likelihood of the three teenagers accessing the mine through the main entrance was very low. This assessment rested not only on the intact lock condition and lack of entry traces, but also on terrain characteristics, appeal to children, and inconsistency with the previously established movement direction. Therefore, the main entrance was temporarily excluded from the direct suspect range, allowing search forces to concentrate on higher probability areas, particularly spontaneous access routes and secondary entrances within the mine area. After temporarily ruling out the possibility that the three teenagers accessed Independence Mine through the main entrance, Alaska State Troopers proceeded to survey spontaneous access areas around the mine, where many old structures were no longer under strict control. During this sweep, the search team discovered a secondary entrance located northeast of the mine, not part of the official tour system, but recorded on old technical maps from when the mine was operational. The secondary entrance was obscured by large boulders and a portion of slid earth slope, forming a natural barrier that made the tunnel opening nearly invisible unless approached directly. Most notably, however, was the freshness of the collapse pile. The fracture faces of the boulders remained sharp. Rock dust had not eroded, and the surface showed the characteristic brightness of freshly broken stone, indicating the collapse event occurred not long before the search. Very likely within 24-48 hours. Troopers flagged this as an anomaly because the timing of the tunnel collapse closely matched the time of disappearance, and if the group had passed through this area, they could have become victims of the event. The collapsed secondary entrance lay directly on the movement axis, consistent with witness Mark Halter's description, and also aligned with the guidance of surface traces on the earlier trail section, reinforcing the possibility that the three teenagers had come close to this location. To assess the degree of connection between the tunnel collapse and the disappearance, troopers conducted further analysis of environmental and behavioral factors. First, the area around the secondary entrance had no intact fencing or warning signs, as such structures had long deteriorated. This increased the chance children could approach without knowing the danger. Second, the secondary entrance led into a portion of the old tunnel system, with gentle initial slope and no major obstacles at the entry segment, making exploration appealing to those without full risk awareness, especially children. Third, the rapid onset of darkness that afternoon reduced the group's visibility, making it difficult to notice hazardous signs on the ground and rock surface. All these conditions made the secondary entrance a fitting point for a potential accident. Additionally, troopers noted several small but noteworthy signs around the collapse area. A few smaller boulders scattered at the base of the pile, positioned in ways suggesting they were ejected by internal compression force rather than natural surface slide. However, since the exact origin of the impacting force could not yet be determined, these signs were treated as reference data, insufficient for conclusion. In this phase, troopers focused on evaluating risk to the three teenagers if they happened to be standing near or passing the secondary entrance exactly when the incident occurred. The size of the blocking rock pile indicated anyone standing close to the entrance could be buried or trapped inside the initial tunnel segment. The lack of movement traces around this area also increased the possibility that if the group had reached the collapse site, they had no opportunity to leave after the event. Combining timing, location, movement direction, and physical characteristics of the scene, troopers formed an initial hypothesis that the three teenagers may have become trapped inside the tunnel behind a collapsed rock pile. This hypothesis was assessed as the most consistent with available data and the investigative direction requiring priority in the next phase, because if anyone survived inside, time would be the decisive factor. After forming the hypothesis that the three teenagers may have become trapped behind the collapsed secondary entrance, Alaska State Troopers moved to assessing the potential for survival inside the tunnel before proceeding with any opening operations. This was a mandatory process to determine the level of risk to search personnel, as well as the survival prospects of the victims if they were indeed trapped inside the tunnel. Troopers coordinated with technical personnel experienced in working at abandoned mines to analyze the structural factors of the area. First was the overall stability of the tunnel. Old mines like Independence Mine often have many sections supported by decayed wooden timbers that are easily weakened under the pressure of earth and rock or temperature changes. Tunnel segments near the surface, where the secondary entrance was located, were most strongly affected by freeze-thaw cycles, leading to the risk of subsequent collapse if disturbed. Technicians assessed that the structure in this area had seriously deteriorated, and any uncontrolled digging could trigger a chain collapse into deeper sections. Next, ventilation potential was evaluated by measuring carbon dioxide and oxygen levels at small cracks around the collapsed rock pile. Although direct measurement inside the tunnel was not possible, data from similar tunnels indicated that oxygen levels could drop rapidly if the entrance was fully sealed, especially in confined spaces. Troopers relied on documents related to the old mine structure to estimate that if people were trapped inside a sealed tunnel, survival would last only a few hours to a day depending on the size of any open cavity. The possibility of compressed air pockets in the tunnel was also considered, but the risks of oxygen depletion and toxic gas buildup were still rated very high. Regarding victim survival, troopers analyzed the realistic conditions the three teenagers might face if trapped. Temperatures inside the tunnel were generally more stable than outside, but still cold enough to cause hypothermia if victims lacked heat sources or suitable protective clothing. In addition, complete darkness and a sealed space could cause panic in victims, increasing oxygen consumption. The likelihood of survival in cases of injury from falling rocks was rated low due to the lack of first aid conditions and inability to self-extricate from the collapsed rock pile. From all these factors, troopers concluded that if the group became trapped at the moment of collapse, maximum survival time would be very limited, and opening the entrance needed to proceed as soon as possible within safety limits. However, opening the entrance depended on risk assessment for the search team. Technicians warned that conventional rock-breaking methods could cause pressure imbalance and lead to additional collapse in upper or deeper tunnel sections. Therefore, troopers had to prepare an entrance opening strategy, complying with safety standards for old mines. This included identifying suitable breaking points to minimize impact on surrounding structures, deploying temporary support equipment before moving large boulders, and limiting the number of personnel approaching the narrow area to reduce risk in case of further collapse. Participating units were clearly divided by task. The technical team handled equipment operation. The rescue team was responsible for approaching the area immediately after the entrance was opened, and the safety team monitored structural developments throughout the rock-breaking process. When all risks had been analyzed and the entrance opening plan approved, troopers viewed this as the necessary preparation step before implementing the next action to verify the hypothesis of entrapment in the tunnel. When the entrance opening plan had been developed and safety measures implemented, Alaska State Troopers, along with the technical team, began clearing the collapsed secondary entrance to directly check the possibility that the 3 teenagers were trapped inside. The rock-breaking process was carried out cautiously, starting from loose outer rocks and gradually advancing to more compacted sections. Large boulders were moved using handheld tools combined with small lifting machines, while the safety team continuously monitored surface vibration and slope stability to prevent additional collapse. After nearly 2 hours of continuous work, a narrow opening sufficient to insert lighting equipment and gas measuring devices was created. Initial gas data showed a slight drop in oxygen levels, but not yet immediately dangerous, suggesting a certain open cavity might exist inside. When the entrance was widened by about another meter, the technical team identified a space that could allow a person to crawl in for inspection. Troopers designated a personnel equipped with safety harness, helmet, and handheld gas detector to approach first. Inside, the tunnel appeared as a narrow corridor with jagged rock walls on both sides, the ceiling showing signs of rot in old wooden support beams. A layer of fine rock dust covered the ground, indicating no significant disturbance in recent times. There were no signs of freshly dug earth patches or mechanically displaced rocks from inside the tunnel, reducing the likelihood that the group had created movement before the tunnel entrance collapsed. The surveying personnel advanced a few more meters and noted that the initial cavity narrowed rapidly, limiting the movement range of anyone inside. Although some long cracks could be observed on the ceiling and walls, none showed signs related to self-rescue efforts. The cracks had the characteristic shape of natural expansion due to seasonal temperature changes, bearing no signs of human impact. When the entrance was opened further, the technical team used high-power floodlights to check the entire observable range in the tunnel. The light revealed the rock dust layers still intact on the surface, with no footprints, drag marks, disturbance signs, or any evidence whatsoever. Several small boulders scattered on the ground had uniform dust coverage, proving they had been stable for a long time and not recently fallen due to any movement. Troopers paid particular attention to searching for evidence of human activity, even small signals, such as scrape marks, fabric fragments, overturned soil streaks, or metal objects. However, the observation results were completely empty. To ensure no details were missed, the survey team used probes to check small recesses on both tunnel walls, which could be places where children tried to hide or got stuck. Nevertheless, these recesses were shallow and showed no traces of recent presence. The survey also confirmed that the tunnel behind the collapse point was nearly incapable of containing the 3 teenagers simultaneously in a way that would allow them to maintain a survivable space for many hours. When the team reached the boundary of the safe zone, the distance they were permitted to enter before ceiling collapse, risk increased significantly. They stopped and conducted an overall assessment. From all direct observations, troopers concluded that there was no evidence indicating that 3 teenagers had ever been present inside this tunnel section. Even though the collapsed secondary entrance appeared close to the time of disappearance, the dust coverage, rock structure, complete absence of any movement traces, and natural characteristics of the tunnel all indicated the area had not been accessed by people for a long time before the collapse. Troopers' initial conclusion was that the entrapment hypothesis in the tunnel section behind the secondary entrance did not fit the collected data. Although the tunnel collapse timing remained an anomaly worth consideration, the secondary entrance provided no signs reinforcing the hypothesis that the three teenagers had entered inside. After direct survey of the accessible tunnel section revealed no signs of the three teenagers' presence, Alaska State Troopers decided to use unmanned equipment to expand the observation range deeper into the mine area, where human access was unsafe due to the risk of further collapse. A tracked camera robot designed for narrow spaces, along with a high-power LED lighting system and gas sensors, was inserted via control cable from outside. As the robot moved through the cleared tunnel section, the technical team monitored real-time transmitted images. The first few meters beyond the human access point showed the tunnel structure continuing to narrow, with the ceiling gradually lowering and both rock walls showing prolonged water seepage decay. Rock dust lay thick and uniform across the entire surface with no noticeable disturbance whatsoever. When the robot advanced about 10 meters further, the camera showed a section of tunnel that suddenly narrowed due to ceiling subsidence, where many large boulders formed a thick layer in a progressive collapse pattern, meaning the collapse had occurred in multiple stages rather than a single event. The boulders in this area had uniform dust coverage, with no fragments showing fresh fracture surfaces or recent displacement signs. This reinforced the earlier observation that the tunnel had no human entry traces for a long time. The camera robot continued through narrow gaps between boulders, recording images of a smaller tunnel cavity behind. This cavity contained wooden support beams that were almost completely rotted, some beams broken transversely with dull fracture surfaces indicating they had broken long ago. There were no foreign objects, fabric pieces, string fragments, scratch marks, or signs of prior artificial light presence. Notably, the robot's infrared sensor detected no temperature anomalies that could relate to living beings or residual heat traces. Air humidity rose according to sensor data, consistent with the characteristics of a sealed old mine with no air circulation. This further clarified that the deep tunnel area behind the collapsed secondary entrance was not a place where the three teenagers could survive for many hours, much less consistent with the possibility they had moved there themselves. When the robot advanced another 8 meters or so, the tunnel ended completely at a second collapse point with chaotic earth, rock, and wood fragments fallen from the ceiling. Here, only a few small gaps remained, but the camera recorded the entire surface covered with thick dust, with no slide marks, scrape marks, or any signs indicating rock had been disturbed near the time of disappearance. After completing the recording, the robot was retrieved for troopers and the analysis team to review all collected data. From the images and signals obtained, the investigation team concluded that the entire depth of this secondary entrance showed no signs proving the presence of the three teenagers. There were no direct or indirect physical evidence, no new disturbance traces, no open areas sufficient for victim shelter, and no factors indicating human movement inside after the mine ceased operations. All data pointed to one conclusion: the collapsed secondary entrance could not be the location where the three teenagers were trapped. With this conclusion, troopers were forced to adjust the initial hypothesis, considering that the tunnel collapse might only be a temporal coincidence rather than directly related to the disappearance, or that the group had gone in a different direction before this incident occurred. After robot camera data confirmed no signs of the three teenagers' presence in the tunnel section behind the collapsed secondary entrance, Alaska State Troopers began compiling all collected data sources from the search routes to reassess the group's movement direction and determine whether the mine area approach hypothesis remained viable. The focus of this step was to review the entire possible route the boys may have taken, based on timelines, distances, terrain conditions, and surface snow observation data. Troopers first re-examined the movement capability of adolescents under the weather conditions of October 12, including rapidly dropping temperatures, early weak light, and thin snow layers that could make some sections slippery. With the time from leaving home, approximately 44,020 p.m., to full darkness, around 6 p.m., the group could realistically cover a maximum distance of a few kilometers, but only if terrain presented no significant obstacles. When comparing the main trail route leading to Hatcher Pass with two secondary routes, one looping west near sparse forest and one looping east through scattered rock areas, troopers determined the main trail remained the highest probability direction because it matched Mark Halter's statement. 2. It aligned with recorded snow compression and disturbance streaks in earlier sections. And 3. It was the shortest route connecting the residential area to the mountain foothills. Meanwhile, the western route showed no disturbance signs, and the eastern route had difficult terrain and low usage, reducing the likelihood the boys would voluntarily go there. When synthesizing survey results along the main trail, troopers noted that the only signs related to the three teenagers' possible movement appeared only in the initial and middle sections of the route, through compressed snow zones and lightly broken vegetation layers. Beyond that point upward, no further traces existed. This created an unexplained discontinuity, because if the group had continued along this route uninterrupted, surface signs, even if wind obscured, should have left at least some small changes on the snow base. Survey results of the collapsed secondary entrance and the mine's main entrance showed no entry evidence. From this, troopers were forced to consider various possibilities of movement behavior. The group may have stopped somewhere before reaching the mine area, diverted to an indistinct secondary path, or left the trail at an unidentified point to explore elsewhere. However, when checking each side branch connecting to the trail, troopers found no new disturbance signs, such as directionally offset snow compression or low-height broken branches. This led to ruling out most side branches, because if the group had turned onto them, terrain and snow layers would reflect some noticeable changes. Troopers also evaluated the possibility the group ascended mountain slopes via different approach points. Some slope sections appeared flat enough for initial access, but surfaces remained completely pristine, with no footprint or slip-fall signs. Loose rock areas, if impacted by human weight, would also show clear disturbance, but all remained in unchanged natural state. Aggregating these analyses, troopers concluded that collected data did not support the hypothesis that the group advanced deep into the mine region. The main entrance was ruled out. The collapsed secondary entrance showed no human evidence, and surrounding mine areas also lacked related traces. This exclusion did not provide a direct answer to where the three teenagers went, but it clarified that no specific evidence proved the group entered the mine system or stood near entrances before the collapse occurred. Temporarily, troopers assessed that the mine entry hypothesis lacked supporting data and needed re-evaluation alongside other directions of equivalent or higher probability. After compiling data from search routes and reaching a temporary conclusion that no evidence showed the three teenagers entered the mine area, Alaska State Troopers returned to one of the most important pieces of the initial investigation phase, the statement of the last witness, Mark Halter. Since Halter was the only person reporting seeing the three teenagers after they left home, verifying the consistency and accuracy of his account became a necessary step to rule out or clarify remaining possibilities in the group's movement direction. Troopers conducted a re-interview of Halter at a location near the mine area for convenient field cross-referencing. In this interview, Halter was asked to describe the entire event again: the time he saw the three teenagers, observation distance, their movement direction, lighting conditions at the time, and any details that could contribute to reconstructing the situation. Investigators noted that Halter was not closely acquainted with the three teenagers, so he identified them based only on general build and familiar clothing of children in the area. When Halter described the observation time, troopers recorded a discrepancy of 5 to 10 minutes compared to his initial statement on the evening of October 12. In the overall context of the disappearance, this discrepancy was not overly large, but sufficient to raise questions about witness memory accuracy. Particularly, this change affected determining the distance the group could have traveled before full darkness, since each small time increment impacted the search perimeter established based on estimated movement speed. Regarding observation position, Halter initially stated he saw the three teenagers at a distance not too far on the route leading uphill. However, when asked to point out exactly where he stood and the group's appearance location, Halter indicated an area at lower elevation than the zone troopers had previously recorded. This led to two possibilities: either Halter misremembered the location, or he inaccurately judged distance at the time of observation. These minor deviations, though not accusatory in nature, reduced the reliability of the statement in its role as investigative guiding data. When asked about certainty in determining the three teenagers' movement direction, Halter said he guessed they were heading toward the mine based on the general direction of the route. Troopers noted that Halter had no direct basis to assert the group was targeting the mine, as he did not observe them approaching any entrance. This caused the initial assumption that the group might be heading to Independence Mine to be re-evaluated as a possibility based on the witness's personal judgment rather than observed fact. During the interview, troopers also considered factors that could affect Halter's recall ability, including poor lighting at observation time, relatively distant range, and Halter not tracking the group for long, but only glancing while moving in the opposite direction. These factors increased the natural potential for deviation in the statement, making Halter's information useful, but limited in precisely determining the three teenagers' route. Nevertheless, troopers recorded no signs indicating Halter intentionally provided false information. Although his statement had minor inconsistencies, no data suggested motive or unusual behavior related to the case. He had no history of involvement in the mine area, no direct connection to the victims' families, and made no statements designed to steer the investigation. After cross-referencing the second interview statement with field data and established timelines, troopers concluded that Mark Halter's sole role in the case was providing the last sighting location of the three teenagers. Although his statement lacked absolute precision, the degree of inconsistency did not exceed typical deviations for witnesses under long-range and low-light observation conditions. Therefore, troopers temporarily maintained the initial assessment. Halter was the sole witness, but not a decisive data source for directing the investigation toward any specific hypothesis. After re-evaluating witness Mark Halter's statement and determining that the information he provided was insufficient to support any specific hypothesis about the three teenagers' subsequent movement, direction, Alaska State Troopers shifted to expanding the search perimeter beyond the mine area to avoid over-focusing on a direction lacking supporting data. The focus of this phase was sweeping all natural hazard locations within a 10-kilometer radius from the last point, with consistent movement signs on the trail, aiming to determine whether the group might have left the main route and inadvertently approached high-risk areas without leaving clear traces. First, troopers examined small frozen lakes scattered around the Hatcher Pass foothills. These lakes often partially froze in October, creating surfaces that appeared stable but could collapse under weight exceeding the thin ice's capacity. The search team used ice structure detection equipment and checked lake edges to identify any break, subsidence, or cracking, suggesting a recent icefall near the disappearance time. Although some lakes had natural thermal cracking, none showed signs of ice collapse due to human or object impact. No evidence, clothing remnants, or signals indicated anyone fell through. Next, troopers surveyed mountain crevasses running parallel to the main trail. Crevasses in this area typically ranged from 1 to several meters deep, some snow-covered to appear as solid ground. The search team used ground-penetrating radar and visual checks at high-hazard positions. Many natural fissures were found, but snow surfaces in the area remained intact, with no holes, disturbance marks, or signs of gravitational impact on overlying ice layers. Troopers noted that if the three teenagers fell into a deep crevasse, at minimum, there would be surface break or snow disturbance signs, but all hazard points showed no such reflection. For avalanche-prone zones, particularly along low-slope sections near the foothills, the search team inspected areas with sudden slope changes or where new snow overlaid old ice. These areas could sometimes form thin snow pockets, causing pedestrians to fall into depressions. Nevertheless, surface analysis showed intact snow layers with no subsidence or collapse signs from body weight. Troopers also checked intersections between secondary trails and seasonal dry water channels, as terrain here could cause slips or disorientation. However, no points showed movement signs or natural disturbance from impact near the disappearance time. Beyond major hazard points, troopers expanded search to less noticeable areas such as small rock fields, obscured large tree roots, and scattered depressions in the valley region. These were places the group might stop or turn if disoriented. Throughout the sweep, the search team emphasized indirect evidence, such as fabric scraps, rock scratch marks, or faint remaining shoe prints. However, results remained completely empty. No foreign objects, impact signs, or movement evidence were recorded within the 10-kilometer range. When cross-referencing all data from the expanded area with initial trail movement traces, troopers noted that the discontinuity in movement signs still could not be explained by any natural incident in the mine periphery or adjacent regions. Although the search perimeter was significantly expanded and covered numerous potentially related hazard points, no area provided information clarifying the three teenagers' journey after leaving the residential area. This result forced troopers to record that the expanded search yielded no new breakthroughs, and the group's subsequent movement direction remained beyond understanding based on current data. After expanding the search to cover the entire natural hazard zone within a 10-kilometer radius without finding any signs related to the three teenagers, Alaska State Troopers entered the phase of compiling all initial investigation data to reach a final assessment before deciding on case handling direction. All information sources, including surface traces on the trail, survey results of the main and secondary mine entrances, robot camera data, topographic maps, witness Mark Halter's statement, and checkpoints from the expanded search were reviewed in chronological order and by relevance level. In this compilation step, troopers focused on three core questions: where the last confirmed sign of the group's presence was located, what the most plausible movement direction was based on field data, and whether any physical evidence indicated an incident or abnormal behavior after the witness sighting. Analysis results show the only relatively reliable fact was the three teenagers' presence on the trail leading to Hatcher Pass, based on snow compression and disturbance streaks near the residential area. However, these traces did not extend close to the mine and connected to none of the surveyed hazard zones. The main entrance to Independence Mine showed no entry signs. The collapsed secondary entrance contained no human evidence. The tunnel interior had no movement traces. Nearby trail branches remained pristine, and the entire peripheral area showed no ice subsidence, snow cracks, or fall signs. Mark Halter's statement, while considered important reference information, had discrepancies in time and location, lacking sufficient accuracy to support or refute any hypothesis. There were no personal items, no signs of abandoned objects, no animal disturbance marks or drag traces related to people. From all these data sources, troopers were forced to conclude that no specific evidence pinpointed the three teenagers' location after leaving the residential area on the afternoon of October 12, 2003. The reconstructed route map showed only a short, confirmed movement segment via traces, after which everything vanished without continuation. This created a major investigative gap that all field data collection efforts could not fill, as natural accident possibilities were gradually ruled out by search results, yet no evidence of criminal behavior emerged either. The case fell into a state lacking sufficient data to pursue any reasonable investigative direction. Troopers completed the initial phase report in early 2004, concluding that all ground search efforts, mine area surveys, and terrain analysis yielded no information to narrow the scope or generate verifiable new hypotheses. With no viable investigative leads remaining, the missing persons file for Evan, Jonah, and Caleb was reclassified under Alaska state standards for long-term unresolved disappearances and officially moved to cold case status in 2004. Transferring the file to cold case did not mean fully closing the case, but acknowledged that the initial investigation phase had reached the limit of collectible data and that reopening would only occur with new evidence, new leads, or changed objective conditions in the future. From 2004 to 2018, the disappearance file for Evan, Jonah, and Caleb remained on the Alaska State Troopers cold case list, with no additional leads emerging to guide investigation. However, in the spring of 2018, an unusual natural event completely altered the case status. That year, Hatcher Pass experienced an above-average thaw cycle. Rapid temperature rise in late April caused multi-year accumulated ice and snow layers to suddenly melt and collapse, creating rare surface deformations near Independence Mine. A group of hikers monitoring the thaw discovered that on a slope long considered stable, a large section had slid away, exposing a deep black opening running into the mountainside. This opening lay about 50 meters from the previously collapsed secondary entrance, at a location where prior survey maps recorded no tunnel or man-made structure. Upon receiving the hikers' report, Alaska State Troopers deployed a preliminary check to determine whether this new opening related to the old mine tunnel system or was merely a natural subsidence phenomenon. Approaching the scene, troopers observed the opening structure did not fully match natural subsidence, instead of the irregular shape typical of landslides. It resembled a long-covered tunnel segment with a downward arcing ceiling depression and unusually flat side walls, suggesting human intervention. This immediately drew attention because the mine vicinity had many secondary entrances and tunnels sealed over time, yet no records precisely located them. During careful survey around the opening, a roughly 40-centimeter-long wooden piece was found at the edge of the newly slid earth. What made the wood piece remarkable was not size or material, but faint, remaining carvings on its surface. These markings lacked clear specific shapes, but featured downward-pointing arrows and a crossing straight line, distinctly different from natural wood cracking or rod patterns. Though eroded over time, the carvings remained clear enough to recognize intentional creation with a sharp tool. Troopers immediately seized the wood piece as evidence, marking the first time since 2003 a potentially human-made sign appeared near the area. The three teenagers were believed to have passed. The discovery of carved wood in a newly exposed opening previously completely covered created a stark contradiction with initial investigation data, where all identified tunnels showed no entry or intervention signs near the disappearance time. The emergence of this opening raised key questions. Could this be an unrecorded secondary entrance in the old tunnel system? And if so, why was it previously concealed? Simultaneously, the carved wood suggested someone had marked the spot before it was sealed, or during the period of the teenager's disappearance. Its location aligning with the group's presumed path made this detail a critical lead. Therefore, after initial assessment confirming the new opening had features inconsistent with pure natural subsidence, troopers officially reactivated the cold case file in 2018 to conduct supplemental investigation, using the opening and carved wood as basis to reopen the long-stalled survey direction. After reactivating the file and determining the new opening likely related to Independence Mine's old tunnel network, Alaska State Troopers deployed a specialized survey team to thoroughly examine the newly exposed structure. The phase objective was to confirm whether the new tunnel belonged to the original mine system, assess human intervention extent in its construction, and collect samples for analysis to determine age and origin of components. Approaching the opening, the team noted greater depth than initially estimated. From the mouth, a narrow corridor extended several meters inward before turning fully dark. Despite partial earth and rock cover, the tunnel segment shape showed man-made characteristics: parallel, relatively flat walls, slightly arched ceiling, and orderly stacked earth rock at wall bases. These features sharply differed from natural subsidence, which typically leaves asymmetrical structures without straight lines. Illuminating the interior tunnel, troopers observed several broken wooden support beams along both walls. Notably, fracture surfaces on some beams were not fully dulled like long-rotted wood. Instead, two beams had relatively fresh breaks with minimal corrosion and sharp fiber edges retained. This suggested mechanical impact at a not-too-distant time, inconsistent with complete natural collapse. Additionally, ceiling earth rock breaks appeared irregular, yet sequential, resembling targeted load-bearing point impacts. This property raised team suspicion that the tunnel had been intentionally disturbed, possibly with tools or machinery to create or conceal access. In the left corridor corner, a cluster of small rocks was stacked separately, not following natural distribution patterns. Such rock stacking is often used for temporary reinforcement or gravity redirection at breakpoints. This was the second piece of evidence supporting human structural intervention. While documenting the scene, troopers simultaneously examined surrounding soil to assess subsidence freshness. Soil samples at old-new layer interfaces showed sharper boundaries than natural variation. Some mixed fine earth rock fragments had smooth cut-like surfaces, further reinforcing mechanical tool suspicion. These findings represented the largest deviation from other collapsed tunnels surveyed in the 2003 initial investigation, none of which showed near-disappearance time human manipulation signs. Beyond visual survey, troopers collected structural samples for in-depth analysis. The first sample was fresher break wood, sectioned, one for fiber analysis, assessing age and rot condition, one for microscopic cut examination to compare tool marks. The second sample was ceiling and wall earth rock from unnatural breaks, taken at varying depths to identify violated geological layers. The third sample was fine soil from stacked rock layers, potentially relocated earth, used to conceal the tunnel. All samples were sealed and sent to the State Materials Analysis Lab. To complete on-site evaluation, the survey team used handheld structural scanners to map the narrow interior space. Results showed the newly exposed tunnel segment short but connecting to a deeper collapse section, suggesting it might be part of an unrecorded long-term secondary entrance not on public mine maps. Close structural observation revealed differences between original and disturbed sections. Original segments had uniform surfaces, while collapsed parts showed lateral earth rock slide marks, not vertical gravity collapse. These characteristics increased likelihood the tunnel had been intentionally disturbed to conceal or create obstacles. After completing initial survey and collecting all necessary materials, troopers issued a report determining the new tunnel was not purely natural, but showed clear signs of human intervention at several structural points. This was critical data because it opened the possibility the structure had been accessed or used near the three teenagers' 2003 disappearance time, directly contradicting 2003 findings. When samples from the new tunnel reached the Alaska State Forensic Analysis Lab, the next phase focused on determining whether recorded breaks, fractures, and deformations resulted from natural collapse or active human action. Forensic analysts proceeded in two main directions: tool mark analysis on wood and rock to identify characteristic mechanical tool traces, and comparison of those traces to standard cut samples from equipment likely used in the area in 2003. First, they closely examined support beams recovered from the scene. Under electron microscopy, fibers on two broken beams showed sharp transverse cuts with small parallel grooves, hallmarks of high-speed saw blades. These grooves did not appear in wood broken by natural rot or rock compression. Instead, they matched repeated motor-driven saw impacts. This was the first mechanical intervention sign. Additionally, fracture faces on beam ends differed markedly. One end showed grain following cracks indicative of aged, weak wood, while the other was nearly fully cut before breaking, suggesting deliberate weakening of support structure prior to full collapse. Continuing with ceiling rock samples, forensic analysts noted shallow, narrow, uniform score lines on stone surfaces. Their shape mismatched natural rockfall impacts or landslide abrasion. Instead, they bore characteristics of metal saw blades or mechanical cutting discs. Notably, some stone fragments had straight-cut edges difficult to form naturally in Hatcher Pass geology. These cuts, combined with on-site rock distribution, suggested collapse may have involved cutting key load-bearing points, then allowing remaining sealing to self-collapse or adding mechanical force. Analysts compared found tool marks to cut samples from common equipment in early 2000s Alaska, including chainsaws, circular saws, and handheld drill-attached cutting discs used in old mines or local construction, comparing support beam and rock traces to standard toolmark archives. The analysis group found highest match with cuts from coarse-tooth gasoline-powered chainsaws manufactured late 1990s to early 2000s common in Alaska mountain households. Cuts from this blade type featured non-uniform depth, narrow parallel grooves, and slight wood tearing from engine vibration. All matched recovered wood samples. Rock trace comparison reinforced this conclusion. Smooth stone surface cuts aligned with light chainsaw contact during wood cutting or support weakening. This indicated hasty or incompletely controlled operation. After identifying matching traces, analysts built the most probable collapse sequence model. The model showed cutting one or two main support beams would create sealing imbalance, overloading natural breakpoints. In already highly decayed environments, this would cause controlled or semi-controlled collapse sufficient to cover the tunnel and make it appear natural. Considering all data, particularly wood age, cut marks, fracture patterns, and impacted stone signs, forensic analysts reached unanimous conclusion. The 2003 tunnel collapse showed clear human intervention signs, not purely natural over time. Moreover, relatively fresh cut marks on wood suggested intervention near or during the 2003 teenager's disappearance. This was the first physical evidence affirming deliberate tunnel collapse. Therefore, the forensic analysis synthesis concluded the 2003 collapse bore human-caused signs rather than natural phenomena. When forensic conclusions confirmed the 2003 tunnel collapse showed human intervention signs, Alaska State Troopers shifted to a new investigative direction, identifying individuals with possible access to Independence Mine around the three teenagers' disappearance time. This key step aimed to narrow potential parties involved in causing or concealing the tunnel collapse. Troopers began gathering data from 2003 mine area archives, including state park maintenance records, seasonal worker lists, trail safety patrol reports, and any rescue or risk assessment logs from that year. Maintenance records showed only minor outdoor exhibit repairs in 2003, with no involvement of secondary entrances or underground infrastructure. Participating workers operated on fixed routes and were prohibited from accessing old tunnels due to structural risk. This list was cross-checked and ruled out as none had reason to deviate to unauthorized abandoned mine sections. Beyond maintenance records, troopers reviewed all 2003 Hatcher Pass rescue or medical aid reports, mostly involving hikers or winter sports injuries from terrain, none related to old mine access or unusual behavior requiring intervention. Thus, legally justified mine access individuals in that year were almost entirely excluded. Another key data source was information from nearby residents and frequent Hatcher Pass users, such as anglers, hikers, hunters, and regular outdoor enthusiasts. Troopers reviewed 2003 interviews and added 2018 follow-ups to identify who was near the mine route during critical timeframes. From this, they identified a small group seen near the mine approach trail in October 2003. Filtering by criteria of mechanical tool capability, mine terrain knowledge, or prior mining construction-related work, narrowed the list to several individuals. Among them were a former park maintenance worker, a local mechanic who hunted in the area, a man who helped build Hatcher Pass trails in the late 1990s, and Mark Halter, the last witness to see the three teenagers. When Halter's name appeared, troopers re-examined his full file to assess fit with criteria. Halter had part-time local logging experience, chainsaw capability, and mountain terrain familiarity. He lived in a cabin not far from the mine route, frequently walked the area, and had flexible movement schedules, sometimes hiking alone. These factors did not suffice to conclude wrongdoing, but placed him in a group with technical capability and access conditions matching tunnel collapse feasibility. Notably, in initial investigation records, Halter's statement lacked details on his movements that day, beyond citing the boys. Cross-referencing old and new information made minor discrepancies in observation position and time more noteworthy, potentially reflecting initial reporting inconsistencies or memory errors, but also possible points needing clarification. Compared to others, remaining listed individuals had lower risk profiles, lacking proximity history to secondary entrances or skills matching found tool marks. Nevertheless, the list was retained for further cross-checking. After review, troopers established a narrowed list of individuals with potential mine access, structural knowledge, or mechanical tool capability near collapse time. Within it, Mark Halter emerged not from direct incriminating evidence, but from satisfying more environmental conditions than others. His inclusion compelled troopers to seriously reconsider his role in the overall case context, though at this point no basis existed to conclude criminal involvement. After Mark Halter's name appeared on the list of individuals with potential access to the mine area in 2003 and possessing mechanical tool skills consistent with the discovered tool marks, Alaska State Troopers decided to summon him for a second interview. The purpose of this session was not to accuse or assign suspicion, but to cross-reference his original statement with all new data obtained in 2018 to determine the consistency of the information and evaluate whether prior inconsistencies carried investigative significance. Troopers began by asking Halter to recount what he remembered about the afternoon of October 12, 2003, the time he saw the three teenagers, his position, their direction of movement, and any related events. Halter attempted to describe it again, but his memory had faded over time. Even in the segments he seemed most confident about, troopers noted discrepancies with the statement he gave 15 years earlier. One of the first contradictions emerged when Halter described the observation location. In 2003, he said he saw the three teenagers on a trail segment near a large pine tree a few hundred meters from his house. In the 2018 statement, however, he pointed to a higher spot on the slope, about 200 meters laterally from the original location and from a completely different viewing angle. When troopers asked about the difference, Halter replied only that he didn't remember clearly anymore, and that so much time had blurred his memory. This could be true, but the positional deviation was large enough to cast doubt on the accuracy of the initial statement, especially since observation distance directly affects assessment of the group's movement direction. Next, the time discrepancy became evident. In 2003, Halter asserted he saw the three teenagers between 4,025 and 4,040 p.m. In the 2018 interview, he said it might have been close to 5 or later because the light wasn't much anymore. Troopers knew sunset occurred around 6 o'clock, so the light level at the time he described did not match his earlier account. This not only complicated reconstruction of the group's route, but also raised the possibility that he had misremembered the timing or deliberately altered his account. Troopers continued cross-referencing Halter's statement with new data about the mechanically disturbed tunnel. When asked whether he knew of any secondary entrances around the mine besides the main one, Halter answered that he didn't remember clearly and only passed by the mine area without ever approaching secondary entrances. However, troopers had found evidence that Halter frequently walked lesser-used trails. Several local residents, when re-interviewed in 2018, stated that Halter had once led others into a few old mine spots, though they could not specify which entrances. This information contradicted his claim of unfamiliarity with secondary tunnels, creating a significant gap in the assessment of his access to the mine area. Another inconsistency was Halter's vagueness about why he was on the trail the day the teenagers disappeared. In 2003, he said he was out for an afternoon walk and happened to see the group. In 2018, he said he went out because he heard some noise, but could not describe the noise. When troopers pressed further, he could not identify direction or distance, saying only that it might have just been wildlife. This shift made his statement lack the stability needed to serve as a reliable reference point. When troopers asked about mechanical tools he owned in 2003, Halter said he only had some basic equipment, but did not recall specifics. However, purchase records from a local store showed Halter bought a chainsaw blade in late 2002 and replaced it in the summer of 2003. When questioned about this, Halter appeared flustered and said he was not sure if he bought one, even though the purchase data clearly listed his name. These details were insufficient to charge him, but painted a picture of inconsistency in the transparency of his statements. After compiling all the inconsistencies, contradictory observation positions, shifting times, possible access to concealed secondary entrances, and ownership history of equipment matching the tool marks, troopers assessed that Halter's statement needed to be treated under investigative standards rather than as mere witness testimony. These elements provided reasonable grounds to believe Halter might possess information he had not fully disclosed. From there, troopers established sufficient legal basis to obtain a search warrant for Halter's residence to look for evidence related to interference with the mine structure or other proof that could clarify his actions during the period of the teenager's disappearance. After establishing legal grounds from the inconsistencies in his statements and factors related to access and mechanical tools, Alaska State Troopers received court approval for a search warrant of Mark Halter's residence. The search was executed at his cabin, located near the forest edge bordering Hatcher Pass, where Halter had lived alone for many years. Troopers followed standard search procedure, focusing on three main target groups: mechanical equipment capable of producing tool marks matching mine samples, items potentially directly linked to the missing teenagers, and mine area materials that might have been brought to Halter's home through movement or storage after the event. Early in the search, troopers discovered an old chainsaw stored in the shed behind the cabin. The equipment matched the type capable of creating cuts on the wood and stone samples recovered from the new tunnel. The blade showed significant wear, and wood chips still lodged in the teeth. Though old, it exhibited signs consistent with the parallel groove producing coarse tooth blade identified in forensic analysis. In the same area, troopers also found a set of replacement chainsaw blades manufactured in the 2003 period, very close to the toolmark comparison samples. These items were seized for direct laboratory comparison. Continuing inside the cabin, troopers found a small metal box carefully hidden in a low drawer of a wooden cabinet. Inside the box were miscellaneous items along with a clear plastic fragment shaped like the remaining part of a flashlight casing. The plastic was pale yellow and sized to match the type of children's flashlight commonly sold in the early 2000s. Although it lacked immediate identifiable markings, the fragment matched the dimensions of the flashlight one of the three teenagers was reported to have carried on the afternoon of their disappearance. This discovery was considered a major breakthrough because no personal items belonging to the boys had been found during the initial investigation phase. Continuing the search in the shed and cabin foundation areas, troopers used ultraviolet lighting to detect unusual traces on the ground. During this process, they found small soil samples adhering to shelf legs with color and mineral composition, different from the normal soil around the cabin. Preliminary field testing by on-site specialists noted the soil contained mica particles and certain minerals characteristic of the area around Independence Mine. The soil structure suggested it could have been carried back to the cabin on footwear or tools when Halter accessed the mine area, although it could not yet be concluded the soil came from the new tunnel. The mineral composition similarity created a noteworthy geographic link. Troopers also checked tool bags, storage bins, and areas under the cabin for signs of hidden evidence. In a carefully wrapped cloth bag, they found a small wooden piece bearing cut marks similar to the wood sample recovered from the scene. This piece did not belong to any repair work around the cabin and showed signs of having been cut with a chainsaw blade. Although its age could not be immediately determined, the discovery raised suspicion that Halter had performed similar operations elsewhere, possibly at the mine. In a nearby container, troopers also found an old pair of rubber gloves with fine rock dust adhered to the interior. On-site examination showed the dust was pale gray, very similar to the stone recorded in the collapsed tunnel segment. This was not conclusive evidence, but the presence of mine area rock dust on Halter's personal items, together with the soil samples, mechanical equipment, and other finds, formed a chain of factors reinforcing suspicion that he had been present at or worked in the tunnel area identified by forensic analysis as humanly disturbed. All evidence: the chainsaw, replacement blades, flashlight plastic fragment, wooden piece, soil samples, and gloves, was sealed and transferred to the laboratory for detailed analysis. When compiling on-site data, troopers determined the degree of match between items recovered at the cabin and traces in the mine was significant enough to elevate suspicion from technical hypothesis to criminal suspicion. Although no direct evidence yet linked Halter to causing the collapse or to the three teenagers, the presence of matching items in type, timing, and geographic location created a substantial foundation for considering him in a role beyond mere witness. After completing evidence collection at Mark Halter's cabin and cross-referencing it with forensic data from the newly exposed tunnel, Alaska State Troopers concluded there was sufficient basis to shift from witness investigation to suspect investigation. The discovered items, particularly the chainsaw matching the tool marks, the flashlight plastic fragment potentially linked to one of the three teenagers, and the soil and rock dust consistent with the collapsed tunnel area, indicated Halter not only appeared near the scene, but may have directly operated in the mine area close to the 2003 disappearance time. On this basis, troopers submitted an emergency arrest warrant request for Mark Halter to the court. The warrant was not based on final charges related to the three teenagers, but on evidence concealment and suspected interference with the mine structure, two offenses sufficient under Alaska law when supported by physical evidence. The court approved the warrant given the case's severity, the prolonged disappearance duration, and the clear presence of concealed or deliberately preserved evidence at Halter's residence. The arrest was executed early in the morning to minimize risk of Halter destroying or moving additional evidence. A trooper team approached his cabin and served the warrant according to procedure. Halter appeared confused but did not resist, partly because he had not anticipated the cabin evidence could be directly connected to the 2003 disappearance. While being handcuffed per standard safety protocol, Halter asked the reason for the arrest, but troopers informed him only within legal limits. He was being arrested on suspicion of interfering with the mine structure and possessing evidence related to the case. Deeper charges were not disclosed at the time of arrest to avoid influencing the ongoing investigation. After the arrest, Halter was transported to the nearest trooper station for standard detention processing, including initial safety screening, identity documentation, biometric sample collection, and personal property management. The entire process was video recorded as required in serious cases. Troopers paid particular attention to Halter's psychological state. Although he did not resist, he displayed increasing tension when questioned about the cabin evidence, especially the flashlight plastic fragment. This change in demeanor was noted to assist behavioral assessment during the upcoming criminal interrogation. While Halter was moved to holding, troopers finalized the file for submission to the prosecutor to establish initial charges. Since no confession or direct evidence tied him to the three teenagers yet, temporary charges were built around obstruction of justice, damage to historic mine structures, and possession of evidence related to an unresolved case. These charges were sufficient to hold Halter, while troopers continued gathering data and preparing for formal interrogation. After completing Halter's placement in detention, troopers held an internal meeting to prepare interrogation strategy. Their goal was not only to clarify Halter's connection to the evidence, but also to assess his level of knowledge about what happened in 2003. Because Halter was the only known person to have seen the three teenagers that afternoon, and because the cabin evidence placed him more centrally than before, the interrogation needed to be structured to force Halter to explain statement contradictions, evidence matches, and reasons for possessing mine-related items. The investigation team prepared a detailed comparison between his 2003 and 2018 statements, listing all inconsistencies such as changed observation times, mismatched observation positions, and his denial of knowledge about secondary entrances despite witnesses having seen him move in seldom visited areas. In parallel, they assembled forensic data on tool marks, soil rock composition, and plastic evidence to create a persuasive chain of reasoning capable of prompting Halter to admit actions or provide new information. The team also discussed possible reactions from Halter in the interrogation room based on his initial demeanor at arrest. His lack of resistance could indicate cooperation or simply time needed to adjust his story. In either case, the interrogation approach had to be both rigorous and flexible, ensuring no legal errors while maintaining necessary pressure to elicit information. When preparations were complete, troopers brought Halter to the interrogation room, where the formal criminal interrogation process began, based on the Miranda rights he had already been advised of. When the criminal interrogation process began, Alaska State Troopers implemented the carefully prepared strategy, focusing on presenting all evidence and technical data in a tight sequence to force Mark Halter to confront the contradictions in his statements. After restating Miranda rights and confirming Halter fully understood his legal obligations in the session, troopers started with simple questions to gauge cooperation level. Initially, Halter remained guarded but did not refuse to answer. When troopers moved to evidence cross-referencing, the room atmosphere began to shift. They placed the seized chainsaw from the cabin on the table and explained in detail how its cuts matched tool marks found in the tunnel. Halter immediately showed discomfort, saying the saw was only used for cutting firewood. But when troopers presented microscopic analysis images of cuts on the wooden support beams compared directly to marks on his saw blade, the similarity became undeniable. Halter tried to argue that any chainsaw could produce similar cuts, but troopers pointed out that the parallel groove pattern, characteristic vibration marks, and wood edge tearing matched almost perfectly with the less common blade type he owned. When Halter fell silent, troopers proceeded to present the flashlight plastic fragment found in the cabin. They showed him photographs of the flashlight Jonah was reported to have carried on the day of disappearance and explained how shape, color, and plasticware analysis indicated the fragment matched children's flashlights sold in the area in 2002-2003. Halter became visibly tense, denying knowledge of the fragment's origin, but when troopers asked why it was carefully hidden in a metal box rather than mixed with ordinary household items, Halter offered no reasonable explanation. Troopers next presented evidence of soil and rock dust matching the mineral composition of the collapsed tunnel. They detailed the mineralogical analysis, mica, quartz, and impurities characteristic of the old mine area. These components were absent from soil around the cabin, leaving Halter unable to reasonably explain their presence on his gloves and shelf legs. By this point, troopers had constructed a picture forcing Halter to face that the truth could no longer be hidden behind memory confusion. When directly asked whether he participated in interfering with the mine structure, Halter denied for a few minutes, but the denials weakened as troopers began cross-referencing his 2003 and 2018 statements. They highlighted the changed observation positions, time discrepancies, and inconsistencies in his description of why he was near the mine on the day of disappearance. They made clear that if his claim of not approaching secondary entrances was true, there was no way to explain the tools, soil rock material, and related evidence appearing in his cabin. After nearly 2 hours of persistent evidence presentation, Halter began to break down. He breathed heavily, avoided eye contact with investigators, and finally said they shouldn't have been there. This was the first sign he was preparing to admit involvement. As troopers maintained silence to apply psychological pressure, Halter began to confess that on the afternoon of October 12, 2003, he encountered the 3 teenagers entering an area near a little-known secondary tunnel entrance. 1. Partially concealed and unsafe. According to Halter, he argued with the group when ordering them to leave the dangerous area. He believed the boys wouldn't listen and continued deeper into a section he considered extremely hazardous due to decayed structure. In anger and loss of control, he used the chainsaw to cut part of a support beam to scare them back. However, the structure was weaker than he thought. When the beam broke, the tunnel ceiling began a chain collapse. He claimed 1 or 2 of the boys were immediately struck by falling rock, causing him to panic. Instead of running for help or attempting rescue, he fled outside. The loud collapse shook the ground surface, leading him to believe the entire tunnel entrance was sealed. Halter stated that when he returned a few minutes later, he heard faint cries from inside, but was too terrified to try removing rocks. He admitted fearing responsibility and believing no one would find evidence if he finished covering the remaining tunnel entrance with rock. When troopers asked about the body's location, Halter stated all 3 teenagers had been buried in a deeper tunnel cavity about 3 meters behind the initial collapse pilot spot he was certain had never been excavated during the 2003 search. This confession fundamentally changed the case nature and was fully recorded for further investigative use. After Halter provided the location where the 3 teenagers were buried inside a deeper tunnel cavity about 3 meters beyond the initial collapse point, Alaska State Troopers immediately coordinated with mining technical teams and forensic experts to prepare excavation operations. Because much of the tunnel area remained covered and the earth rock structure still posed collapse risk, the entire access process was conducted cautiously, using temporary shoring systems and specialized deep digging equipment to avoid disturbing soil layers that might contain bodies and evidence. When the approach team reached the exact position Halter described, they realized this area lay behind a narrow tunnel segment inaccessible from outside during the 2003 search due to complete earth rock blockage. Halter accurately described the turn direction and distance, giving troopers strong grounds to believe his statement was highly credible. After removing the top rock layer, a cavity-like space began to emerge. The earth rock here was tightly compacted with no prior digging signs, confirming the area had never been opened in any previous search phase. When the opening was widened enough for lighting and direct observation, The survey team discovered fabric fragments with faint patterns matching descriptions of clothing Caleb wore on the day of disappearance. This was the first evidence of victim presence at the location Halter provided. As additional fine soil was cleared underneath, the approach team observed human skeletal structures, some fractured due to rock pressure. The excavation pit was expanded millimeter by millimeter to avoid damaging samples. When the entire cavity was fully illuminated, 3 human skeletons in varying states of preservation were discovered. Body positions showed 2 victims buried under large rock sections while the third lay against the tunnel wall, compressed by a slid earth mass. Related items were scattered around, including remains of a children's flashlight, matching the plastic fragment found in Halter's cabin, an aluminum shovel blade broken in 2, and shoelaces colored, as described by Evan's family. Once all remains and evidence were collected, they were transferred to the State Forensic Center for detailed analysis. Forensic experts classified bones, restored anatomical positions, and collected remaining soft tissue samples for identification. Dental record comparison was used first due to prolonged decomposition potentially weakening DNA. Dental records of Evan, Jonah, and Caleb retained from 2003 showed complete matches with the dental structures of the 3 skeletons. Subsequent DNA analysis was performed on sufficiently intact bone fragments. Results confirmed not only victim identities, but also the biological relationship between Evan and Jonah, consistent with the sibling relation reported by family. Successful identification allowed troopers to officially link the 3 skeletons to the 2003 disappearance. After identity confirmation, forensics moved to cause of death assessment. Bone fractures indicated heavy impact force from rock falls within a confined space. One victim showed a skull fracture typical of blunt, heavy object trauma, while the other 2 had multiple fractures along the spine and ribs from compression by large rock masses. No signs of stabbing or sharp object injury existed, nor evidence the victims moved after burial. According to forensic analysis, the cause of death for all 3 was severe trauma from tunnel collapse, consistent with Halter's account of events. Estimated time of death aligned with the 2003 disappearance timeframe, reinforcing the timeline and proving no subsequent intervention to move or alter body positions. The alignment between Halter's confession, geographic location, scene evidence, and forensic findings created a seamless data chain strengthening the entire investigation. With bodies recovered, identities confirmed, and cause of death determined, troopers completed one of the most critical parts in shifting the case from missing persons to fully evidenced criminal matter. With the exhumation of the 3 teenagers' bodies, identification, and cause of death determination through forensic examination, Alaska State Troopers finalized the investigation file and transferred all evidence to the prosecutor's office to prepare for Mark Halter's trial. The trial took place in Anchorage in late 2018, drawing widespread attention as a disappearance case, unresolved for over 15 years that was solved only after a new tunnel opening emerged due to natural change. During the trial, the prosecution systematically presented all evidence gathered throughout the investigation: the chainsaw with matching tool marks, soil and rock dust with mineral composition consistent with the collapsed tunnel area, flashlight plastic fragment matching an item carried by a victim, and wooden piece with sharp cuts suggesting deliberate weakening of support structures. All evidence was cross-referenced with specialized analysis results, from microscopic to physical comparison, forming a clear chain of reasoning that the tunnel collapse was not a natural incident, but the result of human intervention. In addition to physical evidence, the prosecution presented Halter's detailed confession from the criminal interrogation, in which he admitted using a chainsaw at the tunnel entrance and triggering a chain collapse that caused the 3 teenagers' deaths. This confession was cross-checked with field data and corroborated by Halter himself, pinpointing the body's location, a position never identified before, and perfectly matching the excavation site. Troopers and forensic experts were called to testify, presenting search methods, evidence handling procedures, and final results. Experts described the collapse structure as deliberately impacted rather than natural decay of the long-abandoned mine. Forensic findings confirmed cause of death for all 3 teenagers as tunnel collapse trauma, consistent with Halter's account and scene structure. Defense counsel attempted to argue that Halter had no intent to kill and that the incident was an unintended accident. However, the prosecution proved that Halter's deliberate cutting of support beams, leaving the scene without reporting, and subsequently concealing the tunnel entrance constituted reckless murder with awareness of the likelihood of causing death. Defense arguments were insufficient to break the solid legal evidence chain. The jury considered all factors, including the case's prolonged duration, extent of concealment, and especially severe consequences, resulting in the deaths of 3 minors. After several days of deliberation and evaluation, the court found Mark Halter guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances due to intentional collapse of a dangerous structure and failure to assist victims after the incident occurred. A sentence of life imprisonment without parole was imposed, reflecting the severity of the conduct and the prolonged loss endured by the victims' families for over a decade. When the sentence was announced, the case file was officially closed, ending 15 years without resolution in one of Alaska's most haunting disappearance cases. With bodies recovered, cause of death determined, and the perpetrator sentenced for causing the 3 teenagers' deaths, troopers completed the entire investigative process, closing the longest cold case in the Hatcher Pass area while providing definitive answers to the victims' families and the community long shrouded in mystery. Thank you for following this journey to decode a case that seemed destined to remain forever unanswered. If you found the series helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue joining us. See you in the next video where we reopen more files that appeared to have sunk into the past.